All right, so let's get to today's program. So we're gonna do a panel. So this is, I believe, our first time we're doing a panel. We've been talking about it for a while, so bear with us. And we're gonna be discussing the topic of technical documentation. And just to be clear, we're mostly talking about internal technical documentation, right? The TechKnowCon community was really studied about how do we share internal knowledge. So that's where the TechDocs come in. So although some of the panelists have had experience managing external docs as well. So with that, I'll let panelists introduce themselves. So Deepa, do you want to go first and say hello?
Sure. Hi, I'm Deepa Jacob, LinkedIn staff writer. I've been at LinkedIn for about 10 plus years, and a technical writer for about 20. I've worked on both internal and external docs, developer docs, but we mostly focus on internal documentation. Nice to see you all. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Deepa. Kate, want to say hello?
Sure. Hi, my name is Kate Dolan. I'm a senior technical writer at Spotify. I've been there for a little over 4 years, and I've been a technical writer for about 10 years. Also done internal and external documentation, but mainly focusing on internal engineer-to-engineer communications.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks, Kate. Jatin?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jatin Bilamoria. I've been a tech writer for about 20 years now. I've been all over in the Valley. Started out at Cisco, and I've been at companies like AOL, PayPal, Yahoo, Samsung, and now I'm at Splunk, heading off the internal doc efforts. I've done a mix of external docs and internal docs, currently focusing more on internal documentation efforts.
Cool. Thanks, Jatin. And Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Blotner, and I manage the technical writing team at Uber. Started out my career working on external developer documentation, then switched over to internal, which is a many-headed beast. And now I work with the team at Uber on internal documentation.
Cool. And most of you know me, my name is Marco. By the way, I used to also sit in your shoes. So at Twitter, when we joined, we inherited the TechDocs team. And so I took managing that team for a few years and had quite a ride. So I'm fairly familiar with technical documentation issues. So I can speak to that as well from my Twitter days. Cool. So with that, let's get started. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen because other than our cute faces, there's nothing really useful there. So let's talk about one of the things that always interests me is how your technical documentation teams are arranged internally, right? So what I mean by that is I've seen two models. One is where the teams or the writers get embedded with specific parts of the engineering org. And they're sort of dedicated to a system or a tool or an issue. So that's option one. Option two is where the teams are more of as an agency, right? So you can knock at the door and say, hey, we need help with the technical documentation. How would you assist us? So it's less of an embedded model and more of a consulting model. So I'm kind of curious how your companies think about that. And while we talk about that, one question I always had is, who are your tech writers, or how do you think about that, right? So on one hand, it could be engineers who like writing, right? On the other hand, it could be professional writers who then learn the engineering topics. So where do you sort of, and I know it's not black and white, it's a shades of gray, but where do you sort of see your technical writers fit professionally, as well as what do they sit organizationally? So it's a two-part question. So hopefully it makes sense. Anybody wants to start?
Sure, I can start. So at Splunk currently, the internal doc efforts are kind of in a nascent state. We do have some writers who have done some internal docs, although they are currently assigned to an external doc team. But I think going forward, the same type of group structure will apply for internal docs, which is we'll have a central documentation team, that works on documentation as needed. So we'll be kind of a tiger team or a special ops force, if you want to call it that, that helps with documentation on projects as needed. That said, I don't think we'll have nearly enough writers to accommodate everyone's needs. So it's going to be more about providing the tools and templates and support to other engineers to do their own documentation.
Got it. I like the idea of the tiger team. Anybody else?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing at LinkedIn. We've tried both models, and I think there's pros and cons to both models. We were embedded first within 3 large teams, and as LinkedIn grew, we were pulled into like a central team to support all of LinkedIn's engineers. I think the embedded model has a few advantages and works better for certain scenarios. For example, being embedded in a team where we can make meaningful impact, a high impact project. Maybe teams with a new tool or technology that need a suite of docs quickly, or at companies which have the luxury of a large technical doc team. We don't. I think the pros of that is you gain speed through proximity and access to the developers. There's a sense of collaboration and buy-in. That said, it's very hard to scale this at a company our size and the number of technical writers. And as a centralized team, we can ensure that there is a consistent and unified experience across the company. And the team can standardize procedures, templates, style guides, like you said, Jatin, and can help keep all writers together. There's much value in sharing experiences like that and lessons learned. We can also share the workload if we need and get peer-reviewed, work peer-reviewed, which is also, I think, incredibly valuable. So I think that's how we are looking at it right now. For your other question on whether you want engineers who document or writers that learn tech, I think we each have our strengths. I'm a writer who learns tech for each project that I worked on at LinkedIn, and I've been in the industry for a while. Not being an engineer hasn't really been a deterrent at all. Maybe I'd ask a few more questions than an engineer would, and maybe I'd ask questions that an engineer documenting the same tool wouldn't really think to ask, simply because they know it and they assume all users might. I might tailor the content better for the audience, not make as many assumptions as a seasoned engineer would. I might offer suggestions to better structure the document or how to make it more discoverable. And from what I've heard, every company seems to have trouble with quality, discoverability, freshness, all of that. I might just have a better idea of how to optimize the docs for those factors. So I think it's a mix of both. I think we both bring our strengths to the table, and if we work together as a team, tech team, I think we can work off, leverage each other's strengths and build a better product.
Got it. Yeah, I like that idea of the team coming together and actually comparing notes and learning from one another. So that's the advantage of the sort of agency model as opposed to just being purely embedded. But I can see that the advantages also being embedded, because then you're closer to the team you're working with, especially if it's a longer arc of a project, and so you kind of clued in and get to go deeper and learn more. So it sounds like it's a mix of the advantages to both approaches. So thanks, Deepa.
And at Spotify, I started as an embed, and over the past 4 years, we've hired more technical writers. When I say more, there are 4 of us across the company. So we're a small but mighty team, and we've kind of joined together and formed what we call the technical writers group, and we act more of consultants. So we work throughout the entire organization. Although we each belong to specific missions in the company, we operate as a company-wide service. And we are all people who just love to write. None of us are engineers, and we just kind of pick up the tech as we go along.
Got it. I like that. So what I heard that's new for me is this approach of like actually owning a mission as opposed to being assigned to a specific team, right? Because the teams are too narrow, and I think we heard through the conversation it doesn't scale very well, right? Suddenly you need an army of writers if you're going to go a team-based. But missions, you have a little bit more of a control over zoom in, zoom out, and how much you cover. So that's cool. Stephanie, any thoughts on your part?
Yeah, a lot of similar setups to what the others have described, and our model is centralized as well. One of the benefits I've seen from that model is that you find writers being pulled less into projects that might not have as big of an impact. For example, if a writer is embedded with a team, that might feel obliged or need to work on projects like newsletters or like small little updates that don't have a really big impact. Whereas when you have a centralized team, you can use your knowledge about the problem space and about like the business objectives to make sure that you're really focusing on the top knowledge sharing projects that are really going to help the largest number of people. Whereas someone who's really focused on their product area, they only care about their product area. So that's just one of the benefits that we've seen of being centralized is we're able to have more agency and feel less kind of like service providers and more like strategic owners of the work that we do.
Got it. And I'll riff off of that, and thanks for sharing. So when I inherited the TechDocs team at Twitter, it was purely on embedded basis, right? So every writer was on their own. I considered that being almost like a body shop, right? Like we had no knowledge sharing, we had no agency, almost nothing centralized. And it was sort of like, all I had as a choice is to kind of arbitrage who I assign to what project. And so I set to kind of move it the other way around to be more of an agency or consulting approach. And so then the question became, what do you own? And I think many of you spoke about that centralized ownership and the advantages of that, but there's also something about democratizing documentation, empowering kind of the leaves to and engineers to write their own docs. So how do you reason about that? What do you want to hold back as a central team, and what do you want to encourage others to own themselves?
So we just started. We just started.
Okay.
We're calling it the technical writing course at Spotify, where we the technical writers are each taking different subjects that we think help describe the different types of documentation, so that engineers can learn kind of like how to write their own documents. We don't want to replace ourselves, but we're trying to give tools that engineers can use so that they feel more empowered to take maybe a first stab at a document and then have us come in and sharpen it and fine tune it and take it from there.
I've actually never really had the experience of wanting to not have an engineer take a doc project and run with it. Like if an engineer wants to document something and share knowledge, I am a champion of that. And our team works really hard to make sure that we champion that. I would say the one exception might be, we would want to make sure that our team has a finger on the pulse of any resource that's seen as like the source of truth for all of engineering. Like if there's, for example, we have a page that's like, this is like the go-to guide for you're a new engineer. We want to make sure that we have a say in that content because that's so important. And we have really strong opinions about what information a new engineer should see first, for example. But if there's an engineer who's really passionate about it and really thinks something should be added, we don't want to ever stop someone from knowledge sharing. We want to almost kind of like guide the flow of that rush of water, not try and stop it, because we think it's such a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I think the issue is less about engineers writing documentation. I think, at least in my experience so far, the issue is more about long-term ownership and ensuring that documents that are created or documentation that is disseminated is up to date, that it's complete, and that it isn't abandoned. And that's the major problem teams face within a company is there's no lack of people interested in writing something. It's that long-term ownership that becomes an issue over time. So that's where my efforts are focused, is making sure we have some principles in place to ensure that people maintain their documentation. I'm currently working on efforts within the company from the HR level and the IT level to ensure that as people are going through the review and promotion cycles, that documentation is part of that puzzle. That when it comes to review time, you'll be asked, hey, how many documents do you own and maintain? So that's one effort I'm taking part in currently.
It's a big topic, ownership, and we'll double click on that. Thanks for bringing that up, Jatine.
Yeah, at LinkedIn too, I think we're still trying to figure out what ownership means. Is the person who created the doc the owner, or is it the team who has to own the document? So we're still trying to figure that out. And so it's the same problem, Jatin and Stephanie, it's the same everywhere, I think, at this point. But what we are looking at is owning documentation that has the highest impact, like I said before. So deployment workflow, for example, right? I mean, that's something that if you work on it and make sure that the doc set is clear, concise, and thorough and discoverable, it's going to improve developer productivity by a larger extent than just focusing on an individual team's docs. Previously, we just addressed tickets that came in, you know, we'd work on it, we'd send it off, and there was no maintenance plan. And so ownership and staleness are a couple of, and discoverability. Those are three important things that we're looking at right now, for sure.
Yeah, I definitely can agree with those three things. So I'll ask them some questions about that. One pattern I've been noticing is, as I speak to smaller companies, they usually just, all they care about is having this culture of documentation, meaning people document themselves. And then as a company kind of matures and adds more, you know, engineers and technical folks to the team, the issue is less about, hey, are we writing docs, but it's more about, who owns them? Are they accurate and such? At Twitter, we had at the time the largest Confluence installation. It was 250,000 pages across 200 spaces. And the problem was never that you can't find something. The problem was that you would find 10 different answers to the same question, right? And then the bigger question is, well, which one is authoritative? They're all from, you know, very senior or staff engineers. And so how do you know which one to trust, right? So that was the issue. So I'm kind of curious how you manage that ownership of documentation. Like, what does it mean to be an owner? Is it a person? Is it a team? When do you pull it back, right? Like certain documents, I think, Stephanie, you mentioned, there needs to be one canonical version of that's, you know we can trust. So who owns that? Is that your team? So how do you reason about ownership in general for the docs?
I think in general, like Deepa mentioned, it's really hard to know, is it the person who first created the page? Is it the person who last touched the page? Is it the team of one of those people? What we've been doing for some time now is that it's the team that is kind of responsible. If, you know, people change teams or get called away to Hollywood or whatever, you at least have some kind of semblance of ownership if those transitions happen. But it's almost, I haven't found a way or thought it to be super useful yet to like stop people from creating new things, but to find ways to encourage people to check if something already exists first. We do have this thing called knowledge cards that associates source of truth documentation with a product, tool, service, or term. And that ownership is kind of managed by whoever owns the service, whoever owns the tool, and that's like a larger group. But when it comes to who owns the content, more often than not, it looks like the last person who touched the page is the first person that kind of gets reached out to with questions or potentially feedback. So it's kind of tricky. I don't quite have an answer to it.
Yeah, and to maybe add a little bit more trickiness to that, Tony Tam had a good point. What happens when you have documentation that cuts through multiple concerns, right? So it's not an issue of this team that owns that microservice and that's clearly their docs on that. But what if you have things that just span multiple teams, and who ends up picking up the buck with that? So yeah, just another way to think of the reason about that.
What we are trying to do at LinkedIn also is we've been trying to identify the source of truth, so to speak, and call them certified. So, a few quarters ago, we introduced this concept of certified pages, and a certified page is basically a page that's officially endorsed by a team. It's published to the widest audience possible, and it's considered to be the most trustworthy source of content. And these pages are like given the certified and fresh tags or labels to signal its quality. And boosting or promoting these certified pages in our internal search also help with discoverability and the confidence that the content is accurate. We are not 100% sure that works all the time, but it's certainly working more than what it used to be, better than what it used to be.
So your team is going around and certifying the documentation and saying this is currently current.
Yes, yeah. For right now, it's a manual process, but at some point we plan to automate that.
Any other thoughts on ownership, Jatin? You had a lot of thinking through this.
Yeah. So at Splunk, we have some documents that are maintained by specific teams, and then we have documents that are kind of meta documents where they handle multiple different aspects of working within the company. So we have an engineering handbook, for example. And for that kind of document, it's not owned by one specific person, although we do have some shepherds like me who are now responsible for making sure that as comments come in, as things go out of date, that we identify owners for that content. So currently, there are owners in specific parts of that document, but there are other sections that have no owners and that are out of date. So it's a continual process of kind of care and feeding. You know, it's like a garden. If you don't, you know, add fertilizer, if you don't weed it every now and then, it will get overgrown. That's what I see myself as. It's kind of like a gardener who has to go in and make sure that specific portions of a garden are well taken care of, and that we have people who will come in and plant new seeds or take out the old weeds. And so that's the analogy I like to use.
Kate, anything on your end for Spotify?
We will have the specific teams that own the products really own the documentation. We have a team that's made up of technical writers initially that owns the golden paths, but otherwise we kind of will use or rely on the team to tell us about updates. Something that we started doing, I have a project now that touches in almost an entire mission. It's quite a big undertaking, but so we're trying to find a specific team that can own the documentation, and then I'll work alongside them for that. But it's definitely the who owns it, who has to update it is something that we're still trying to figure out.
Got it. And maybe, you know, one other, we can talk about this separately, but another way to kind of reason about this is different types of documentation, right? So from API docs to golden paths that you mentioned, to best practices, to run books, etc., right? Like, so each category of or type of docs can have a separate, I guess, policies around ownership as well. So it's another way to reason about. But one thing that's kind of related to ownership is this concept of drift or staleness, right? Because documentation by its nature is a point in time, right? And so the system or tool or best practice that it's being documented evolves, right? We're all in, you know, innovative companies, and as such, things are changing daily. So how do you manage that drift, right? It kind of relates to the ownership, and we can maybe weave in, you know, considering different types of documentation. But I'm curious about managing drift of documentation, because that was the biggest challenge I had. Like, again, it wasn't that docs weren't there; it's just that I didn't know what to trust when I searched. I found too many docs on the same topic. So the question of drift or staleness and managing that.
So passionate about this. This is like one of the biggest pain points. One approach we've tried is to not try to boil the ocean. So our content has a really long tail. So there's a smaller subset of pages that are viewed very frequently by a very large number of people. So what we've tried to do is to sort of identify popular but stale pages, which I think this idea was actually mentioned to me by Beth Fryer from Facebook, where you look at the popular but stale pages and assign tickets to engineers to either validate that, hey, this is really stale, but it's still up to date, or hey, address these tickets. And as a result of that effort, we've seen in our very popular pages, the staleness decrease over time, so that at least the pages that are viewed very, very frequently by a large number of people are less stale. And then that way, like the really long tail, those pages might still be stale, but it's affecting a smaller subset of people.
Got it. And just to be clear, that review is happening manually or automated? Because Jasmine is also asking about, is there, does anybody do anything to automate some of this verification, I guess? So.
Yeah, it's currently manual because, for example, there might be some kind of page that's like a landing page or something that we know just by looking at it instantly that it's fine, but figuring out how to automate that, we're still figuring out.
Yeah, just jumping on what Stephanie said, currently the process is a bit manual in terms of identifying pages that are out of date, but we are looking into using some metrics to see what is more high value documentation or more popular documentation. We have a service within the company called GoLinks. Basically, it's a URL shortening service. And along with that, we get some valuable data as to who's visiting these sites and which links are more popular. So this is one way we can get metrics on what documentation we can prioritize, both in terms of updating, and also we're working on a search that will allow folks to look through documentation, and those same metrics will help towards ranking search results as well. It's still a work in progress, but we're looking to see how we can at least use some automation in it.
One project that we have going on currently is trying to score these end user facing pages. We've defined a scoring rubric we are hoping to automate that can provide this doc quality insight to executives, managers, and content owners, and that will be surfaced up in a dashboard. At some point, we are working on automation right now. So this rubric would allow us to make more objective evaluations of doc quality, and if we are able to automate it, can reduce the time and resources it takes. Plus, it, like I said, it could eventually be part of our dashboard, which I'll talk about when we talk about metrics. But that's something that we're experimenting with currently.
So you're basically experimenting with trying to figure out some heuristics to automatically score pages.
Yes, that's right.
Cool.
We did it manually last quarter, and right now we're trying to automate it because it has to hook into all the different platforms. Like our internal search, and we have a jargon engine. We have multiple apps that it has to hook into. So we're trying to figure out ways to automate that this quarter.
Kate, anything on your end?
Just similar. Our process is very manual. We're trying to experiment with different ways that we can keep documents up to date. But just for now, my coworker and I, when we work on a project, we'll then make little calendar reminders to be like, remember to check in to see if the documentation is still fresh. So pretty manual.
Got it. Yeah, we did. At Twitter, we did this thing where for a hack week, somebody wrote a little script that was analyzing all those 250,000 pages that we had in engineering, and trying to, based on some heuristics, identify how important it is and how long it hasn't been updated. And so basically we assigned Jira tickets then to the teams and said, hey, here's, you own these 47 pages, and 20 of them seem to be below the cutoff, and we would declare them deadwood and archive them unless you do an action and review them, right? So we basically identify the low-hanging fruit and then put the onus on the teams to respond, or it gets archived. So that was good. We removed tens of thousands of pages that way. So that helped a little bit. But one of the challenges was measuring drift, right? Because that's now that doesn't have any connection to the underlying code or systems, right? So we wouldn't know that the docs could be old, but still highly relevant, or they could be new and no longer relevant as well, unless we connect the docs in the code. So one of the questions I have is, how do you reason about the discoverability? Like, I heard that come up a couple of times. So what systems or tools or things you imply internally to make sure that the engineers looking for the right answer get the right answer as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think we could look at discoverability issues from a few angles. Could be poor information architecture. It could be that content is in different locations. Maybe it's about optimal internal search, or sometimes it's just not having socialized the content. And I think addressing each of these are important. We are working on a few things. We're trying to provide guidance to content owners on improving searchability by, say, making the title of the doc more descriptive or meaningful, adding relevant keywords, adding labels, and then advertise the content through newsletters or training classes or tech talks, mention it in product demos, etc. We're also hoping to be able to define the content location for each type of content. So developer docs goes to in repo, wiki docs is mostly for product or project team-based content. And our search team has been working on a unified sort of search experience, pulling relevant content from across all these different platforms. So these are the different ways in which we're trying to come at it from all directions. Again, it's all experiments, so we'll see how it goes.
It's definitely something we're trying to experiment with. We're working on a golden path for search right now, so going to learn a lot about it. But that's definitely been very interested to hear what everyone has to say, because that's something that we've been struggling with. Is we have search in our TechDocs system, but it's limited right now. The team is working to build it out, but it's definitely something that we're looking forward to learning more about.
Yeah, for us, the problem is kind of multifold, because we have documentation that exists in different silos. So we have Confluence, we have Google Docs, we have stuff that's in GitHub hosted Markdown pages. And so it's not just a problem of discoverability, it's where do you go to find that source of truth? And so the choice is, do we force everyone into one of those silos, which I think is a losing proposition based on the initial research I've done with folks, or do we make that information more discoverable through kind of a single lens that we apply to it? So I think the focus is going to be more on that, which is kind of creating a search that allows folks to, whether it's in Google Docs or Confluence or somewhere else, they can at least go to one place to search for it. So that's the effort we're going through right now. And like everyone else, it's kind of an experiment, work in progress, but it's something that could make a big difference.
We've done really similar. It's almost, I'm like, were you in that meeting with me? Like, we're all doing really similar approaches, really similar problems. One of the things we're trying to do kind of as a Band-Aid in the interim, like while we're trying to figure things out from the tool side, is to help engineers to think about search, like Deepa said, as part of their like content process. Like, you're not just thinking about what should I write, where should I put it, but after you write it, do a practice search and see actually what shows up when you search for that term. Is it your page? If it's not your page, like, what do you need to do to make sure that your page goes higher? Or if it's not your page, hey, maybe you can reach out to these other teams and say, like, hey, can you delete this? Like, or like, this is really stale. Or, you know, you can downvote or add input into the search results so that your search gets better. It's like a Band-Aid fix, of course, but to even get them thinking like, oh yeah, I should check and see, like, are my users even going to be able to find this content? And it's something that just a lot of engineers wouldn't naturally think of, because maybe they're really optimistic and they hope for the best. But while we figure that out, you sort of have to teach people to do the workarounds.
Cool. And I'll get back to that question about the types of documentation, and then how do you give some guidance to engineers and empower them to create a docs that they're searchable and somewhat consistent and so on. So what we did at the time, we wrote this tool that would scan all our. So first of all, we've kind of focused on project documentation differently than this cross-cutting stuff that would live in the wiki, right? So at the time we had about call it 1,000 projects, various Git repos, both internal and external for open source. And so we wrote a tool called Dogbird that essentially scanned through all known repos in engineering and rendered them as HTML pages. So first of all, that brought single place to discover all sorts of inline docs that existed. And then we wrote another tool called GoFind, speaking of Go links, that was basically a federated search based on Elasticsearch, for which we created custom plugins for all known repositories of knowledge. So that included Dogbird, included Wiki, Google Docs, as well as Review Board and other places where you may find interesting nuggets. And then it was all about, fine tuning the plugins and like importance of various search depending on what your profile is. So an SRE would get a different search results than an engineer because we knew there are different concerns, for example. So that was the work. It sounds like a couple of us we've been thinking about this in the same way from different angles, reinventing the wheel. So I thought that was interesting. Cool. So I'm also reading through the chat, and one of the questions that keeps coming up is about standardizing the docs, standardizing back to being centralized. How do you give some kind of guardrails to engineers on what the right way to document things is, so that across hundreds of teams the docs are somewhat consistent, and if they are, maybe there's also opportunities for automated linting or equivalent, like evaluation of that. So how do you reason about templates or standardization or just empowering engineers to do things in more or less consistent way?
So we have what's called the Spotify Technical Writing Handbook. It was modeled after the Spotify Engineering Handbook so that it could feel more familiar to the engineers when they're writing their own documentation. And it's very in-depth. So it goes from things like when to use bold and then to like how to write a golden path. So it's a big document, but it's well laid out. My coworker wrote it, and then we did a team review of it. And it's been, so far our feedback, we circulate it as much as we can. It's in like every Slack channel you can imagine, Spotify, it pops up. And we get feedback on it, and we ask like, is this helpful? Did you learn anything? And now we're starting to add templates to that as well. I saw some post templates, big fan of templates, think they're great. But yeah, writing the handbook was like a really great practice for us to kind of establish writing standards at Spotify and then circulate that information with the engineers and anyone else who's writing technical documentation.
Yeah, we have a good set of templates too, but I think it could do with a bit more socializing, and not too many engineers know about it, unfortunately. But we are also looking at including these templates in our in-repo solution. So, we're talking about wiki and in-repo as two separate content locations. Another thing we are doing is also we offer a writing good docs training class that's presented to engineers only, and it's quite popular. We also used to have office hours. So if you needed help with anything, just focus on the content, don't worry about the style, we've got you covered with these templates. So that was I want to say popular, but also not as popular as we would have liked. So these are a couple of things we're trying there.
Books are fickle though, and maybe it's just my experience here, but we found that when we had, for example, when an engineer would spin up a new service, it would automatically spin up a template of documentation, or when they spin up a new wiki space, it automatically pre-populates with the template pages. Many times they would leave them there, right? So then you have a whole set of documentation with these empty skeleton pages, which actually made the search and the quality of the content worse. So we tried removing them being pre-populated by default, but more socializing that they're available and saying, hey, here's just your landing page. If you want to add a getting started, a troubleshooting, whatever how-to page, here's how you would generate that template. But instead of pre-populating the pages, letting the engineer decide to add it, so that we don't have as many of those like empty pages just kind of floating around. I don't know if any of you have experienced that same thing, where the templates are there, but then they just sit there, and then you have like thousands of like get started pages that have like nothing in them.
Yeah, that's a common problem. I think at a previous company, we had created templates, and the uptake on them initially was good, but you found that a lot of people were leaving stuff uncompleted, like they'd fill out one section of it, but not the whole section of it, all the sections rather. And so that is a common problem when you disseminate templates like that. In addition to templates, one thing I'm working on is kind of a guidance on where things should live. So like I mentioned, we have content that can be in different platforms. And so one of the documents I created was, if you're writing docs, based on the kind of content you're writing, it should live here versus here, right? Because otherwise everybody chooses their own kind of pet platform to write it on. So if it's collaborative, for example, and a lot of people are working on it, Google Docs is probably the natural choice. Whereas if it's something that is going to be long-lived and has gone through a few cycles of review, you probably want to have it in a Git-based format, or Confluence, depending on the use case. So I think that the tendency for people to kind of choose what's comfortable for them is very high when it comes to engineers.
Yeah, we did something very similar where we defined, so back to Deepa's point about educating engineers how to write, like we would also run a class, and it was very popular as well. And we would then guide them onto, what to use for what purposes. So Google Docs is great for collaboration. Git is great for stable things that are related to systems. Wiki is great for things that are cross-cutting concerns, that are more, best practices type of things. So that's kind of, we would provide those guidelines. But just back to templates, I've seen a couple of questions from Polly and some others on. So, and you mentioned also it's great having templates, but what if they're empty? Like you have this ghost towns of templates, and so obviously that's not fun for anyone. So what's powerful is being able to lend them automatically, right? So when we talk about at scale, doing that, so that's exactly what we did. We would basically write linters for your readmes and such, and then give you a mark 0 to 10. How up to date your docs are, how good, quality-wise good your docs are, based on the linters. And so at Twitter, we like to gamify things. So if you had the perfect 10, we created these t-shirts, the perfect 10, that to engineers, and just became this social thing like, hey, how do I get a t-shirt? Well, in preview docs, how do I improve my docs? And because it was the automated process, the linting tool would give you, here's why you're 7 out of 10, here's, actionable items you can do to actually improve your docs, and then make Jira tickets based on that. So that was the workflow that created this gamification and kind of the feedback loop that worked reasonably well at the time. So speaking of feedback loops, how do you collect that? There was some question about do you automatically create a PR or Jira ticket or whatever it is to kind of notify people? Do you send them an email, or do you just walk to them and tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, a lot of people are using your docs and here's the room to improvement? So how do you think about that, getting the feedback and making it actionable at scale, right?
You have to treat it like an engineering problem. And so you have to use the systems that engineers use to fix bugs in any other part of what they're building. So I think tickets or any other system that your teams are using, you have to funnel it in that way, so that it can be triaged and prioritized and actioned on. And then you have metrics too of wow, you have 100 open doc bugs. That's not great. Because I think email, it's easy to brush it aside or let it drift away.
Yeah, well, open issues or PRs. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we'll open an issue or a PR. So if they go through their repo and see a bunch of open doc PRs, okay, I guess the technical writers have gotten their hands on our docs. Perhaps we should take a look.
Yeah, currently it's a pretty manual process where I am, but we are hoping to at some point have a universal header or footer that allows anyone to submit feedback on a piece of content, and either shoot that to a Slack channel or to create a Jira ticket based on that.
Deepa, anything on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few things we are doing with metrics, surfacing up all this information. Like I said, we are working on a few things, and that's $1 million question, isn't it? If we can't improve what we can't measure. So typically tickets are not given the same priority as engineering or development related tasks. So you find a lot of these Jira tickets for doc fixes floating around or backlogged. And so what we're doing right now is just creating metrics around it. So LinkedIn's recognized how important this is and how much, just developer productivity is impacted. And so we have an incredibly talented and dedicated team looking into what we call CKG. That's basically closing the knowledge gap. We started off with a few experiments. We're continuing to build on it. The first is what we call a content dashboard. And that basically gives executives, managers, content owners an overview of the content metrics that most matter for development productivity. That would include metrics like traffic for certified or trusted pages versus uncertified pages, hardest to find pages, stale pages, number of unanswered Stack Overflow questions for that particular project tag, etc. And we hope that showing this page engagement through discovery, usage, and feedback metrics, we can improve the doc quality and discoverability and content completeness. And another project, like I mentioned before, is trying to score end user facing pages on a rubric. So that hopefully will also be added on to that dashboard. And we are hoping that that will improve, fix these things and improve developer productivity and happiness. And I think providing actionable insights is key. There's no point if you just provide raw data and not empower content owners to improve those metrics. So socializing a clear definition of what those metrics mean, the signals, the recommendations to improve these metrics, we hope that will help these content owners produce and maintain a set of high quality pages that are fresh and easily discoverable. So that's what we're doing in the metrics side, because Jira tickets are not working as we hoped it would.
Yeah, and I know metrics are something that's important to you, and I know you've been kind of focused on that quite a bit. So maybe let's riff off of that a little bit, because the main point of generating a feedback loop is that you can do something about that, right? So I'm kind of curious, what do you measure? What do you track? What are the key things that are important to you as a team?
Is the question for me?
Or everyone, and maybe Deepa, you mentioned developer productivity, and you also mentioned happiness as an engineer. So I'm sort of also curious how metrics feed back into that and make that a reality. So question for everyone. What do you track?
I think the discoverability of content and finding fresh content causes a lot of friction for developers, right? You want to empower them to produce and publish their software with the least amount of friction. And so that's the metrics that we're calculating in terms of content is what those would be. Is it stale? Is it easily discoverable? Is it in the first 10 search results of first 10 search results? Is it, when was it last updated? Quite a few, how many people visited, unique visitors? Quite a few things that we're looking at right now. And we are trying to tweak that to see what makes the most sense to content owners. So that's what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, like when it comes to developer happiness, we also look at where sentiment around documentation compares to sentiment around other developer tasks. So like, do people hate documentation more than they hate testing? Like, or like where does it fall in that list of flow? We also look at like ratings on pages, like a 5-star rating for each page to see like, oh, what is the sentiment? Do people like hate this content or is it okay? Another thing that's maybe, I'm not sure the value of it yet, is like the number of contributors or the percentage of contributors on a team. So for example, do we want to say like, oh, 25% of your engineering team should have contributed to documentation in the past X days? Or is it okay if just like 2 people are really into documentation and your content is great, but everyone else kind of like lets it be? So that's something we're thinking about, is when you think about contributors, do you want to actually have a target for that? Or is it okay to just have a couple of engineers that are really into documentation and do it really well?
That's an interesting question. We recently conducted a survey for our internal engineering teams, specifically asking about different aspects of documentation. So we asked things like, are you able to find information easily? Can you search for it easily? Is the documentation you're reading easy to understand? Is it up to date? Is it fresh? Is it enough to complete your work? And do you think, as a content creator or an engineer who's creating documentation, do you have the necessary resources and bandwidth to create documentation? So we actually conducted a survey, and it was pretty illuminating, because things we thought people might think are good weren't good, and other things were not so good. So in our case, the clear issue that stood out was like content was hard to find and not up to date. But when they did find the information, it was at least easy to understand. And the other issue in terms of content creators was very few people had backups for the content that they maintained. So if they left the company, they transitioned to another team, they decided, hey, I'm done with this document. They didn't have a backup owner. And that is an early indicator for future stale content. So this survey helped us, it helped informed us to learn what to focus on next in terms of the tools we provided, templates, guidance we provided within the company.
We mainly will just look at page views. But Stephanie, I really like what you said about contributors, because we'll see at the top contributors as well as the team that owns the documents. And so we usually will reach out to them just to see like how, if the developers are like, we're still getting pestered with questions, like something's not working. But otherwise, we just pretty much go off page views to see like what, if a document's getting a lot of traffic.
Yeah, we also ran a survey. We ran a survey continuously through engineering organization just to find out like what are the top things and the bottom things. And technical documentation was I think second worst at the time. So that's when we sort of took over the team and turned it to 180 and invested in all these other things that we built in order so that we can track. So, all these things that you all mentioned, right? So page views, staleness, a number of JIRA tickets, and all that sort of stuff was then feeding into how do we fix our documentation situation. And so we ended up investing quite a bit, but it was the squeaky wheels that informed that initially, right? It was asking the pulse survey, like what are the things that are impeding you the most in, to Deepa's point, developer productivity and happiness, right? Be able to do your best work here. So that's kind of how we informed it. Cool. So maybe the next question is a little bit about what does it mean for success, right? Like, so great, we now have the feedback loop, we have metrics, we have the data, but what does it mean for your respective teams to be winning, to be successful? Curious.
You have to be ambitious, but realistic. I don't think there's going to be a world where in a large company, engineers are like, I love writing documentation and it's perfect to find everything. And this is the best time of my life. But I think having sentiment around finding and creating and authoring documentation should just be a lot better for all of us, should just be a lot better than where it's at now. And if there's specific business metrics or goals that you're driving around developer productivity or around trying to get adoption of X or Y technology, you can use those as really good indicators of, hey, you know what? Like, we transitioned to this framework and everyone was able to adopt to it in our target timeframe. That means that our knowledge sharing tools and systems were successful. So it's kind of vague, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I think it's kind of idealistic to think that engineers all of a sudden are going to say, hey, the documentation at the company is great and it's changed my life. I think the lack of complaints, on the other hand, the lack of people saying docs suck, is the silence actually is more powerful than people talking in some cases. So I think if we were to conduct a survey in the future, seeing some of the sentiment trending towards, instead of saying, oh, I can't find information or it's out of date, starting to see that edge towards, instead of getting a 1 or 2, starting to see 4s and 5s. and that will start to indicate, because I don't think we'll there will always be very vociferous engineers who make their voices known, but usually people are a bit more passive aggressive. And so I think trying to find sentiment based on the number of complaints we're getting and surveys and outreach is going to be more powerful than expecting engineers to all of a sudden, be running through a field of green flowers.
Got it. So just make it suck less, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's the same for us. Better scores, doc scores in our productivity surveys, empowering engineers to write better by creating content, templates, and training and whatever, and to be able to automate some of our metrics, figuring out the metrics to be able to scale, so we can focus on helping engineers write content and just have everybody happy. Well, at least I can hope. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did a survey of our documentation system and asked, since it's mainly used by engineers, saying how happy are you with it? And they all were like, the search is not great. That's putting it kindly. And we were like, we know. But it was great insight that's really, something that wasn't working. So it's how we can improve the documentation experience. Because I think for us, with engineers are able to find their documents easier and use the system in a more friendly way, then it helps us, help them.
Cool. All right. So I have one final question, checking the time. So, anything that you're excited about on the roadmap for your TechDocs team? So we talked about what you're doing today. Is there any initiatives or projects that are on the horizon that you're really looking forward to?
I mentioned earlier that we have the Spotify writing course, so the Spotify written language course that we're developing now, which I'm very excited about. I have my sections that I'm dedicated to writing, and it's been broken down into different parts about like onboarding documentation, how to onboard people, writing guidelines, how to use our different documentation tools, like how we use Confluence, how we use Google Docs, how we use our TechDocs system. So I think it will empower engineers, hopefully, to write documentation, or at least have them know we're here to help. If they see that we have this system, they're like, oh wait, technical writers are here, they can help us out. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I touched upon it earlier, but my kind of interests right now especially lie with kind of driving the culture of ownership within the company. And it kind of goes not just in documentation, but everything. But in my case, selfishly, obviously, it's documentation. But it's basically the idea of if you are responsible for something, you feel a general sense of ownership over it. You feel a sense that you are taking care of this. And in terms of documentation, if you created documents or you are responsible for a certain area of your engineering, that you ensure that people can understand how to use it, and that you create documents that are understandable, and that from time to time you make sure that they're up to date, and that part of being an engineer is making sure that people can understand the technology that you're creating. It's not just about creating it, but making sure people can use it. So that's one thing I'm especially excited about, is working with HR, working with IT to ensure that's institutionalized within the company.
I think one thing I'm really passionate about for the future is finding ways to tie in all of these ideas and all of these beliefs that we have about knowledge sharing and its importance with the company's efforts around diversity and inclusion. I personally believe that knowledge sharing, documentation, training can be a huge lever for underrepresented groups and people who may feel intimidated about learning, particularly in the technology space. And so I think I'm really excited about trying to tie all of these levers into those other initiatives that have a lot of headwind right now and that are making a lot of progress, to maybe try to reach people who may think like, yeah, documentation, but I hate writing. But if they can tie it into diversity and inclusion efforts, it may motivate them to be more engaged with this process I think we have to invest on a tooling side, but on the cultural side, I think it's really exciting what we can do by marrying those two.
For me, I mentioned it earlier, the couple of initiatives we have with metrics, the content dashboard, trying to automate our quality criteria and getting more feedback from engineers, developers with the different feedback loop experiments we're running. That's something that I'm really looking forward to get more granular feedback so we can fix things.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just checking time, and just want to sort of bring us to the close. So let me make sure. So again, this was our first panel. I just want to thank all the panelists, and also please tell us what you thought, how this went as a format. It's a different format than a presenter in a slide deck, so it's more conversational. So we would love to know what your thoughts are on the format. We're thinking about doing more of these in the future if the community says yeah.